Good evening, everybody. I'm John Schreiber, the President and CEO of the New Jersey Performing Arts Center in Newark. To begin tonight, here's a greeting from a Newarker and a friend, Senator Cory Booker.
Hi, everyone. It's Cory Booker. I am honored to be here with you today. I want to thank NJPAC for always gathering us together in community, in spirit, for a purpose, for celebrating life and culture, to create community strength, and to lift the virtues of our culture and of our country and of our world in our hearts and in our minds. And today's gathering for this screening of a documentary about John Lewis, this for me is profoundly important, as I hope it is for you. John Lewis is a hero. I am literally here sitting in the Senate because I stand on the shoulders of incredible giants like John Lewis. I had the privilege of getting to know him quite well and to be able to call one of my heroes also one of my friends. And I can tell you, knowing him on a personal level, that he was one of the people I've met in my life of the deepest of all integrity. He lived his values, his faith, his heart, his kindness, his decency, his love. And his legacy must be a challenge to all of us to continue that spirit of getting in good trouble, of doing what's right, even if it means sacrificing our security and our safety. He was a tremendous force, and his death may end his life, but the death of John Lewis has not ended his love. Thank you all for giving your attention to this very important work and to continuing that legacy.
Thank you, Senator, for those warm words from the heart. Tonight, even as we celebrate the work of John Lewis, by sad coincidence, we mourn the loss of another champion of civil rights, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ginsburg was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Congressman Lewis was born and raised outside of rural Troy, Alabama. Although they came from these two very different corners of the country, they devoted their lives to a common cause, advancing equal justice for all Americans. And we owe it to them, to both of them, to continue that work. I'm pleased to be able to welcome you to this conversation. I'm thrilled that we have viewers tuning in tonight from Miami to Cincinnati to Los Angeles and many, many cities in between. I want to thank the 62 performing arts centers and cultural institutions who have partnered with NJPAC on this project. Here in Newark, part of our DNA as an anchor cultural institution includes thinking and talking about race, about social justice, and the path forward to a more perfect union. We've been seeking a way to expand that conversation, and we've been so gratified that when we suggested the idea of a nationwide watch of John Lewis' Good Trouble, followed by tonight's discussion, our cultural colleagues across America eagerly joined forces to create this exceptional night of remembrance and thoughtful dialogue. For NJPAC, tonight's discussion is part of two ongoing series, and I'd like to thank our local funders for continuing to support this work. We're grateful to our friends at PSEG, especially Rick Thickpen, for sponsoring the PSEG True Diversity Film Series. And we thank everybody at Bank of America, especially Etta Dank, for supporting NJPAC's Standing in Solidarity Social Action website, where we have all kinds of resources, from recordings of prior events and articles, to podcasts and book recommendations, to links to help you vote, complete the census, and contact elected representatives. Think of it as a toolkit to help everyone be more active participants in our democracy. I encourage you to give it a look at njpac.org/takeastand. We're grateful to Magnolia Pictures and my old colleagues at Participant Media for making tonight possible. And I also want to thank Dawn Porter for making such a terrific film. A successful documentary educates us, inspires us, and entertains us. Dawn's brilliance as a filmmaker is that through her art, she welcomed us into John Lewis's life in a way that invited each of us to become good troublemakers. You should know that if you haven't already rented the film, you have until September 30th to rent it through your participating arts organization. And remember that $5 of every rental fee goes back to the nonprofit you rent the film through. At the end of our conversation, we'll close the program with a virtual dance performance by Jamar Roberts, choreographer in residence at Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, who was commissioned by the March on Washington Film Festival to choreograph a solo in tribute to Congressman Lewis. And we'll share that performance at the end of the discussion. I hope you'll hang out for that. And now I'm honored to introduce our moderator, Khalil Gibran Mohammed. Khalil is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. Today, he is professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School and director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. He's a Chicago native, but those of us in New Jersey also have a claim to him because he got his PhD in history from our own Rutgers University. Khalil, welcome.
Thank you, John. And thank you to NJPAC and your amazing team for putting together this program tonight. As I said to you backstage, that feels like old times being part of the great work of cultural institutions. NJPAC is a cultural anchor institution for the great city of Newark, where not too far away, my family has lived for a long time, and also where I spent a lot of time doing my academic work as a graduate student. I'm also grateful for this terrific panel of folks that are gonna share a lot about their own thoughts about the legacy of John Lewis tonight, and just to be part of a community of national audience, of fans, of other cultural centers around the country. So, so it's a real treat to be here tonight. Let me get started and to welcome our panelists to the stage. Tonight, we are joined by Dawn Porter. She is an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose work has centered on some of history's most iconic figures. Current projects include a multi-documentary series with Oprah Winfrey and Prince Harry on mental illness and well-being. She's working on a feature on the great civil rights lawyer, power broker, Vernon Jordan, and a project about former chief official White House photographer, Pete Souza. Previous projects include the series Bobby Kennedy for President, a Peabody Award winning film Trapped about laws regulating abortion clinics in the South, and Emmy-nominated Gideon's Army, a subject close to my own heart, about 3 Southern public defenders. And importantly, she is tonight's filmmaker on the great legacy of John Lewis, Good Trouble. Please welcome Dawn Porter. Yes, we're also joined by the president of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch III, a Newark native. He is appointed recently, has been appointed recently as the 14th secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, the world's largest museum, education, and research complex. His appointment began just a year ago, so a timely update from the new president. Prior to this appointment, Bunch was the founding director of Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where he led the museum from concept to opening. It took 11 years. And that is by Washington, D.C. standards, breaknecking speed. He worked closely with Congressman Lewis on that project, who introduced the bill to Congress. He's a historian, he's an author, a curator, an educator. Secretary Bunch is one of the nation's leading figures in the historical and cultural community. Welcome, Secretary Bunch.
Thank you. Pleased to be with you.
Awesome. And last but not least, a hometown favorite for the great city of Newark, Mayor Ras Baraka was elected 40th mayor of Newark, New Jersey's largest city in 2014. He's a native of the city whose family has lived in the city for more than 80 years. Mayor Baraka has led Newark with a progressive agenda, reducing crime to its lowest levels in 5 decades, returning local control to schools after more than 2 decades, addressing affordability while maintaining steady growth, and working to transform the economy by combining employment, procurement, and residential strategies. The son of two poets, Amiri and Amina Baraka, the mayor is a published author, a poet, and a spoken word artist himself. Last but not least, welcome to the stage, Mayor Raz Baraka.
Thank you.
Excellent. Just a note, we are going to have time for a Q&A in about 45 minutes. And so I invite you along the way to use the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of the panelists. We'll get to as many as we can, and there'll be some folks backstage combining questions. So most certainly if your particular question isn't asked, or it's asked in a strange way, it's probably because it's been revised to reflect other people's ideas, just so that we can get as much content from you in this conversation. So let's get things started. First, we have this incredibly talented filmmaker. And Dawn, you've been quite busy lately. Your latest film on Pete Souza is just dropping, and there's been wonderful news about it. When I joined the Schomburg several years ago, Pete Souza's work had already been collected, and we put on a show back in 2012. So I know how incredible his work is and how visually arresting this documentary must be. But tell us about what's that?
It is.
Yes, yes. So tell us about this incredible film that we've all watched. We've got 1,000 people around the country, vast majority of whom taken the time to watch this documentary. How did it come to be? Where did the idea come from?
Yeah, first of all, it's just a thrill to be here. I spent 16 years living in Montclair, New Jersey, so Newark is our sister city, and also near and dear to my heart. Many friends still in Newark, so thank you all for gathering, and for our host cultural institution, of which I'm very proud and spent many happy hours, NJPAC. And of course to the mayor for hosting us, and to the secretary for always just showing up. He just always shows up, and I know how busy you are, so you are incredibly appreciated. I had done a 4-part series about Bobby Kennedy, and it's called Bobby Kennedy for President. It's on Netflix, and we interviewed Congressman Lewis for that series, and his contribution was one of the most significant. He told a story about being in his 20s and organizing a rally in the African-American community in Indianapolis. It happened to be on the same day that Dr. King was murdered. And Kennedy's older white aides were saying, there will be rioting, it's too dangerous, you cannot speak to the audience. A very young John Lewis said, you must address them. Kennedy did speak that night. It is widely thought of as one of his finest moments. It's the only time he addressed his brother's murder, the hands of an assassin, in public. And Indianapolis was calm that night. And when Congressman Lewis told the story that he was the person who basically, was instrumental in convincing Kennedy to speak, it just triggered in me this thought that there are so many other stories that the congressman would have from this incredible life. So, I always say, like, some people have hope chests, like I have hope video collections. Yeah. And as we were, kind of really immersed in the archive of the civil rights movement, a lot of footage of John Lewis, kept appearing. So CNN approached me. They had just been very successful with their film about Justice Ginsburg, RBG. Mm-hmm. And, I like to joke they were looking for another 80-year-old to feature. But it was just really good timing. To go from viewing the civil rights movement through the lens of a very powerful person who was not of a minority group, to turn it around and view it through the eyes of an activist who pushed, Bobby Kennedy to become the civil rights icon that he would become. I thought that was, as a filmmaker, that's a really great gift to get to turn the lens and look at the same time period through a different person's eyes. So it just felt really like, plus it was the congressman. It was such an honor. Mm-hmm. I had interviewed him a few times before, so we were suited to one another, I would say.
Well, I have to add this. Most people have seen Forrest Gump, and there was there were several moments in this documentary that you had this incredible archival footage, and I was like, "Holy smokes!" Congressman Lewis was there too. So, in the way that Forrest Gump shows up at all these historical moments, of course, this is all fiction, but this is real. And so, maybe talk to us a little bit about the archives itself, because I think certainly for young people and certainly for this very expansive country we have, a lot of people will be very surprised that John Lewis wasn't a bit character, that he lived in the midst of a tremendous uncertainty, in the midst of elder statesmen who, he was in the room with Bayard Rustin, with
Yeah.
Dr. King, with the Wilkins. Everybody's there, and yet here he is too. And we don't really know that part of his story as much.
Yeah, that was really one of the things that I was most interested in, bringing to the forefront and really discussing, is people who know the congressman know that moment on the bridge. But I wanted to back up from that. John Lewis didn't just show up on a bridge. Mm-hmm. He studied. He planned, he and the other civil rights activists. So you're right. I mean, I hadn't really focused on his speech, being the youngest speaker at the March on Washington. And the speech he gave was a rabble-rousing speech, John Lewis's instrumental role in the Freedom Rides. So you're right. John Lewis just kept showing up. But I think that also speaks to who he was. He will always, I have a problem using the past tense. He would always say, when people say, how did you do this? And he'd say, I was just trying to help out. And he was really a person who would see something that needed to be done and step into it. And so, a number of people, we did a really great panel with Ambassador Andrew Young. Mm-hmm. And he said, John wasn't a person who was trying to be a leader. He just kept getting pushed forward because people wanted to hear what he had to say. And I think by looking to what needed to be done, he ended up in some of the most important moments in, our civil rights history, because that's what needed to be done. We needed a march. We needed freedom rides. We needed to gather in a church and protect people who were going to be attacked by, a white mob, forcing the Kennedy brothers to send in the National Guard. I mean, he was at all these places. And so, I just felt like we needed to understand more about that history.
Sure. No, it's incredible. So Secretary Bunch, you've accomplished more as a public historian than most historians can ever dream of, based on the students they teach or the books that they write. You help teach millions. So tell us about your relationship with Congressman Lewis and the specifics of the role that he played in helping to bring this treasure to life.
Well, first of all, let me thank all of you. It's an honor to be with this amazing group of people. I admire you all, and I'm just lucky. I'm somebody that actually got to know John Lewis in a way that allowed me to understand, as Dawn just said, who he was, where he was, but also what an amazing, gentle person. And what I was struck by is that for many of us now, people talk about John Lewis as sort of a gentle visionary, and they forget he was a revolutionary, that he was a radical, that he had that will of steel to get something done. And I think his work in helping to create the National Museum of African American History and Culture symbolizes that. This idea of building this museum was 100 years old. And Mickey Leland and then John Lewis picked up this idea and said, you know what, this doesn't need to be something we just talk about. Let's introduce the legislation, let's get it done. And so for almost 2 decades, John Lewis introduces legislation, often knowing it's going to fail, but not letting failure deter him from his dream is really a way to understand the congressman. And so as we got closer to being able to get legislation passed, what was clear is that people then came together around Congressman Lewis. They trusted him. They may not have been sure what this museum should be, but they trusted him. And to be able to eventually, after 18 years, get legislation passed, get it signed by President George Bush, and then instead of stepping back and saying, okay, I've done my work, he said, I want to help. And so when I first met the congressman, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I meet John Lewis. What do I say? And the first thing he said to me is that I don't want to get in the way, but I want to help. I want to be there to help you in anything you need to do to build this museum. And so what's important is there are often people who get something done by simply making it happen and stepping away. He was there almost every day. He would call me. He would actually ask me, so how's it going? Not what's the work, how's it going for you? I was really stunned by that he would take the time to care. And what he would do is he would help me at all steps of the way, because building this museum, part of it was, even though the legislation was signed, how do you get it on the National Mall where the world comes to see what it means to be an American? How do you get the support from Congress? And every time we hit those hurdles, Congressman Lewis said, here's a way to do this. The one thing I remember more than anything else is we were struggling to make sure that people would be comfortable we get this museum on the National Mall. And Congressman Lewis said, let me take you around and meet some of the more conservative members of Congress to make sure they understand why this was so important. And he didn't just open the door, he carried me in. He talked, he pushed, he cajoled. And I think for me, there is no National Museum of African American History with Culture without John Lewis. Not just because of the legislation, but because he continued to put his fingerprints on this for 11 years. And every time I thought we hit a hurdle that we may not be able to overcome, I called John Lewis. And every time he said, here's the best way we can move forward. So I was very blessed to see his will of steel as he really pushed this through. I was blessed to see his vision, because the other thing that impressed me so much is that this is somebody who understood the power of history. He recognized that history was an amazing tool. We see it today as people are struggling trying to understand this moment we're in. But the congressman knew that this was a story that shouldn't be just about the civil rights movement, that it should be a broad story about America through an African-American lens. And so I had many conversations with the congressman about why history was important. What did he hope would happen if people had a chance to grapple truthfully with the American past? So in many ways, just like America, John Lewis made the National Museum of African American History better.
Wow, wow. What an incredible story about the dogged commitment and unwillingness to accept no for an answer. I mean, that's one of the things I think is a very impressive part about the way the documentary itself captures his life. And so, I mean, talk about embodying 50 years after the civil rights movement. So many people put on rose-colored glasses and sort of memorializing the heroic sacrifice and martyrdom of the people who walked with Dr. King. But this man walked and walked and walked and sat and got arrested and kept walking. And here he is also playing a part in passing on to generations forever that these stories actually mattered. Maybe tell a little bit about this comic book that inspired him as a young person, because I imagine you must have something original from Congressman Lewis representing the artifacts of his own civil rights march. And I don't mean
Let's just say it was important to make sure that I picked his pocket as well. And so I think one of the things that John Lewis reminded us is that this is a story that had to appeal to a diversity of people and a diversity of ages. And I mean, the graphic novel was a great example. He sort of said, here's a way to reach new audiences. And he would always challenge me to say, make sure the museum isn't just for people over 60, but make sure that the museum is a reservoir of history that people can dip into regardless of their age. And I think that desire to basically realize that this is a struggle that continues and that the best way to make sure it continues is to ensure that younger generations understand their responsibility. As you said, starting this, Khalil, that we're all standing on shoulders. He wanted people to know that. And he wanted the younger audience to recognize that it was their obligation to continue the struggle for fairness. I think in many ways, what I think John Lewis reminded us was that the African-American experience in many ways was the quintessential American experience, shining light that led to freedom in so many other quarters, whether it was on issues of gender, whether it was on issues of economic fairness. And in some ways, what he wanted was this museum to say, we are all responsible for changing a country, and that issues of race are issues we all own, not just one community.
Yeah, no. Well, I was looking for a copy of the documentary, Don, or a copy of the comic book in the documentary that has the cover of Dr. King on it that he first read and said, I gotta know this guy. He tells the story in the film of when he meets him. But it's just an incredible way to see him come full circle from thinking about how he himself became conscious of this movement happening around him and then would later try to pass on that same tool to young people. So Mayor Baraka, many people on this webinar don't know you were an educator before you became an elected official, first in city council, and then went on to become mayor of this great city. How do you think about your own role in educating young people and public service and thinking about it in light of the legacy of Congressman Lewis?
Well, first I want to thank you for doing this, NJ Pack, everybody. I want to thank Dawn Porter for an incredible documentary, and always good to see Dr. Bunch here with us. You know, when I first was introduced to John Lewis, I was a kid watching Eyes on the Prize. My mother and father obviously made us watch Eyes on the Prize, and that's the first time I saw him, not knowing fully who he was, but saw this animated young guy in the film with all these giants. And then, you know, later I met him again at the Congressional Black Caucus, watching him speak on panels and different things. And then with Congressman Payne here in Newark, speaking many times. And actually as a kid, being able to watch Eyes on the Prize and seeing him in person actually made me feel like I knew him for a very long time because of that. And I think publicly, why it's important, this documentary is important because films like Eyes on the Prize, films like Good Trouble are important to educational pieces for our young folks to be able to see, to be able to grasp, understand, because it gave me a relationship with him and I didn't even know him. And I think this does that. It gives our young people a relationship with him, a relationship with history, a relationship with the time that they couldn't possibly be in, and experience what happened then and make a real kind of connection to what's happening in a present sense. I think as much as we possibly can, we need to make sure these films are available. You know, when I was at Howard University, I used to go to Moreland Spingarn Library that battles all the time about which one is the largest library in the world, that or the Schomburg. I used to go there and watch films all of the time. And it was very helpful for me to watch that as a young person. So when I went to college, I was able to rely on that information and go and draw down on other things that I had to get, vertical files and other people that I saw that helped me expand my information and my knowledge base, simply because I was introduced to Eyes on the Prize at a very young age. I think it's important to be able to do that, not just for educational purposes, but for social engagement and interaction for our young people to get civically involved and help them see their self in the picture of things that are happening in the world and the country and see their relationship to it. So it is incredibly important, and I enjoyed watching it. It brought up a series of emotions, and I think it'll do the same thing for young people who don't even know really the impact John Lewis had or who he is as a person. I think the film will elicit the kind of emotions that's necessary to get them to do to not just be active, but do the most important thing that I think a lot of people don't do, and that's study and research.
Yeah, yeah. I love you mentioning that because in the news lately has been the story of Kamala Harris's parents, the now Democratic vice presidential candidate running with Joe Biden. And the cover story on the Times, I believe last week, pointed out that her parents met essentially in a Black Studies study group.
Right.
One that gave birth to a very radical part of the movement, including the Black Panthers. But these were young folks in early 1960s who were prepared to not just change America, but to change the world. And I know as someone who teaches young people, I'm constantly reminding them that you actually have to study to be effective in the change work. I loved seeing, for example, Don, Jim Lawson in the film. I mean, this guy is probably one of the least heralded because he stood at the center of the kind of groundwork along with folks like Septima Clark at the Highlander Folk School, or Ella Baker, who had for 20 years before John Lewis stepped on the scene, had been a major organizer for the NAACP. But what you see happening is this infrastructure, whether it's in the South, whether it's in Harlem, or whether it's in the Oakland area, of all this ferment around learning.
Yeah. So Reverend Lawson still teaches his nonviolent workshops. He's, I think he's 90, yes, I think he's 93 or 94. He lives in Los Angeles, and he still teaches that workshop once a month. And now he's doing it by Zoom, so you can all tune in to his workshop. But that was really, well, I have two things to say. One is, to this point about what the museum means to our broader culture. It certainly means something to see Black and Brown people, their sustained accomplishments over time. That is a gift, for my children, for me, that's immeasurable. But then to have the wider culture also experience, just the soaking in of that sustained, experience of culture. So we filmed, Secretary Bunch was, when I said he always shows up, I was like, can you give John Lewis a tour of the museum? Because I know you don't have anything to do. And so he came over and welcomed the congressman, who loved that museum like it was his own home. And so, we kind of went through the back entrance. And the idea was just to have the secretary go through, and me knowing that Dr. Bunch is a historian, I was like, whatever conversation they have is going to be, great. So we start going through, and of course, Mr. Lewis has been through the museum many times, but he always responds to what he sees. So they just start talking, having a conversation, and then slowly people realize what's happening. You not only have Congressman Lewis, but you have the Secretary of Smithsonian essentially interviewing him about what happened. And it was like this Pied Piper kind of, people just started following them just to listen.
Wow.
And, we probably had like 50 people just following along, a lot of young people of all races listening to this conversation between, these two giant people. So that was really fun for us to see. And their relationship was really great to see, because I think there's a real affection there that I think is important to show, between people, between men, between important people. So that was, that was just like a really, one of the many great, kind of moments. But one of the reasons why I wanted to show, that John Lewis studied and the other civil rights workers studied, and what they did was intentional. When you talk about breaking down systemic racism, language matters. So if we only say John Lewis and the civil rights workers were brave, we ignore their intellect and strategy and planning. And so I was hoping to introduce more, let's talk about their intellectual gift to the movement, which is the brilliance of how they prepared, planned, and executed their, their actions.
Yeah. No, that's really important through line, both to his own experience over decades, both during the movement and following, but also the 2018 midterm that sort of frames a lot of the footage. I want to come back to that, but I want to follow up with Mayor Baraka on something. So again, a lot of people don't know this, but you are quite active on Instagram, which is the platform of choice other than TikTok for dancing, which will soon be illegal in the United States.
Right.
But on Instagram, you spend a lot of time with Newark's young people, passing on the legacies and the stories. And I just wanted you to share a little bit about that, because one of the things that I think is really clear in both your trajectory is, both of you, that is Congressman Lewis, and you, Mayor Baraka, come from protests to politics.
Right.
I wonder how much how do you pass that on? Because sometimes it's easy to get stuck in one or the other, right?
Sure.
The politician who loses sight of the value of protest to create the conditions for change, and the protesters who lose sight of the responsibilities of governance when it's time to actually, take over and do the work.
Right. I call it offense and defense, right? So a lot of times we so first of all, I do that because it's important. I'm still an educator at heart. I'm always going to be that. And so when I get information, when I have things, I always want to share it, and particularly to younger people, to give them a different perspective, different ideas, particularly since they're being bombarded with all kinds of information. And I want to make sure, I play my part. I remember when I was a teacher at Warren Street School, when I was just starting out, I used to play hip hop music in the classroom, right? And, I thought I was doing something, hip, slick. So I told my mother about it. I said, yeah, I play a little hip hop music. She said, that's great, but probably you should play something that they wouldn't be able to hear without you. And so that always stuck with me to make sure that when I'm in a place that I share things with people that they may not normally have access to if I was not present. And so the things that I was able to get in my household, growing up, it became an obligation for me to share it with other people, the culture, the protest, the politics. And it's easy, like you said, to lose sight of that. But you have to remember, like I said, offense and defense. A lot of times we so used to playing defense, when we get the ball, we give it back. Right? So we can play defense again, So we like the defensive strategy, and it's important to have defense because you can't win the game without defending your goal line, right? Yeah. But you also have to have an offensive strategy. You have to march the ball down the field, and so it's important to have a whole playbook. And a lot of times we don't have that, right? We so used to doing the defensive thing that as soon as we get the ball, we fight the people to give the ball back so we can actually play defense again. And so we have to understand that there are two parts to this, and we bring them both together, right? And that your offense is not successful without a defense, and the defense is not successful without an offensive strategy. And, so I try to keep that in mind, that I have to play defense, and I need people marching, I need people protesting, I need people doing the things that are out there struggling, but I also have to have an offensive strategy. Once the marching stops, we have to make sure that we score.
Yeah. No,
one of the things that I think is one of the many things that I love about Dawn's film. I stopped telling her how much I love her films because it's gone to her head. But the one thing that really struck me was what you said, Dawn, which is this notion of helping people recognize that at the moment we're in now, that you've got to be strategic. You've got to think about how do you bring together disparate parts of a movement to affect change? How do you ensure that protest leads to vote, leads to change? And I think in many ways, all of that is embedded in your film. And I think that what I came away with just looking at it again recently was this notion that part of the great strength of the civil rights movement is the ability to study the past, the ability to think, the ability to dream an America yet to be, but the ability to then figure out what are the steps you need to do to make it more than a dream. And I think that to me is the great lesson for the generations now trying to affect change. That the key is you can have a momentary change, but to have the long-term change, it's really about strategy and building on, as the mayor said, building on kind of making sure you're recognizing that just knocking on the door isn't enough. Figure out what you want to do when you get inside the door.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's one of the reasons why, thank you for that, but that's one of the reasons why it was really important to me to interview, you know, the squad, and to make
Can you
sure.
can you tell everyone, just to make sure we've got?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
First year representatives, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Rashida Tlaib, Representative Ilhan Omar, and Representative Ayanna Pressley. And the congressman felt a deep kinship and alliance with those young women. And people forget he was once the rabble rouser. He was once the person that the deans of the movement, you know, tried to rein in and pull back. And, you know, so whereas he is now seen as, you know, a senior statesman and part of the, you know, establishment in Congress, he, you know, really had this strong connection with those younger people. But I think what his objective is just what you're saying, is to assure that they saw the importance of going from defense to offense, of moving from the people knocking on the door and pushing so hard to being the people that would get them some things done, you know, would actually write the plays and you know, we're going to keep it the sports analogy, would move the ball down the field, right? So how do you, right, who's calling the plays?
Yeah.
And when you switch from, you know, to the person who you have to have an agenda. And that is one thing I think, you know, there are so many reasons why the congressman will be so missed, but that is something I think that's the leaders of today need to take up that mantle in working with our young people who are so effective at mobilizing to becoming effective at what is the ask, right? What are the specifics that we need in order to serve communities who need the most help? And so I think that is a large, you know, kind of mantle that has been passed to this next generation of leaders. And I think, you know, it's really important to identify those folks, raise them up, but also support them as they figure out how to become the national voice, you know.
Well, there's a little bit of sleight of hand, Dawn, in what you just said, because we know, for example, that that's at a certain point, elected officials can often become calcified in their own normative vision of change. You know, this is how it works. This is the way we do things. And that's not just for Black politicians, that's across the board. But one of the things that you started out your last comments about was saying that Congressman Lewis identified most sincerely with folks who were most disruptive to business as usual. And I think that's a lesson for the transitions that inevitably will happen with this latest generation, wherever they show up in 25 years, to really be thinking about what does it mean to continuously see what young people bring to social movement change.
Yeah.
And I would suggest that part of what this film also captures is the ability of John Lewis to bring people of different points of view together. I mean, I think anybody that's been on the sojourn, like I've been with him 2 or 3 times through the South, you know, yes, we always take the picture of crossing the Edmund Pettit Bridge, and you know, you realize that when you get to the top of that bridge, what you saw below, and how he still had the courage to keep walking. I'll never forget that. But what I was really struck by was we'd be on these buses with Democratic congressmen, Republican members of Congress, media people from different points of view, and John would bring them together to say, look at what happens when this country confronts its past, and look at what you can do if we can cross these boundaries and work together. And I was stunned the times I went. I would see Republicans who I would never have expected, never had expected that they would be there, and they would sort of talk about what they learned from John Lewis. And what hit me was, if I can tell one quick story, we were on one of these sojourns and there were Republicans and Democrats. And, you know, we were driving from Mississippi. We had just left Mrs. Mary Evers, and we were on our way to Alabama. And we were full of this sense of the possibility of America, oh, what we could do. And we pulled into a rest area, and on the wall, the rest area was "nigger go home." And what struck us is that the congressman said, he reminded us that you will never completely erase that. So the strength of a nation, the strength of these members on this tour, was to be ever vigilant, to recognize that that writing on the wall symbolized a deeper malady that we now are seeing. And so I really was just struck by his ability to get these people who I would have never sat down with to ride and spend 2 or 3 days revisiting the march on the civil rights movement. Very powerful.
That's a really wonderful anecdote, and I appreciate you sharing it. I want to talk for our remaining time a little bit about cultural production. And all of you are living witnesses to its power. Dawn, in the film that we're talking about that brings us here this evening, Raz, you know, you started your career literally in the shadow of one of the greatest artists of the 20th century, your father and mother. And you, Secretary Bunch, you've been a custodian, a caretaker of the literal cultural artifacts, the voices, the ideas, the embodiment of cultural production. So can we talk a little bit, all of you, about the role of art in social change? And I must say, Dawn, if you could start us off, I mean, I so appreciated you spending so much time inside of Congressman Lewis's home and in his office, and letting the camera linger on his Beardens and his Jacob Lawrences. I mean, you know, I had met Congressman Lewis a few times. He spent time at the Schomburg, but I didn't know that he was such an avid fan of African-American visual art.
Yeah, that was one of the, you know, brilliant surprises, you know, and because he was such an open person, he invited us into his home, and then I start looking around and I thought, is that what I think it is? And so, you know, the first time I just asked him, and he started doing his tour, and then, you know, then we filmed it. And then after we filmed it, I started to get really anxious, and I thought, I cannot tell the world that the congressman in suburban Atlanta has the largest collection of Jacob Lawrence original paintings in his dining room. I mean, and he also had that he rotated his paintings. Wow. That was the current configuration of art. There's a scene that we cut because I kind of overdid it with the love of the paintings, where he was speaking to Sarah Lewis, and he was saying that his siblings had asked him to donate a painting to the church. And they were like, you know, we need to raise money. And if you just donate one painting, you know, we could fund the church for years. And he said to his sisters, I would love to do it, but my paintings are like my children. I sleep with them. I wake up, I say good morning to them, you know, so I'll see if I can find one. And she said, have you found one? And he goes, not yet. I haven't found a painting that I can give up yet. But he wished that he had artistic talent. That was something he greatly admired. He started out, his wife was an avid collector. She was from Los Angeles, but he also, these were his friends, and he started collecting their art because he liked them, and he loved, you know, he loves colors. Like, he loved bright colors. And, but I also really have a sense that Congressman Lewis had such a big outside life. You know, he was giving big speeches and rallying people, and that there was a lot of output from him. Mm-hmm. And that when he was home, this was the inner kind of peaceful surrounding. And I really do think that the arts for him, also music, really, like, he will always talk about the music of the civil rights movement. He loved dancing. He could listen to those songs over and over. Mm-hmm. But I think that fed, in addition to his faith, his religious faith, but I think it fed him and helped him get prepared to go back out and do what he needed to do. very, very calm. I think the thing people were always surprised is how quiet he was in person. Very, people, I don't know what they thought, like if you had lunch, he would be like, march to lunch, like that was not, it was very quiet. You could tell a joke with the best of them and loved you to notice his joke. I mean, so really a full life, a very full, I think very, in a lot of ways, balanced in that way, life.
Yeah. Secretary Bunch, did you get any of that art? Has it been bequeathed to the Smithsonian?
Let's just say I'm patient. I think, though, it's really important on what Dawn was talking about, and that is, in some ways, what the congressman did, what many of us do, is use culture as a reservoir we dip into, a reservoir to bring context, a reservoir to bring calmness, a reservoir to motivate us. And one of the things I think is so powerful about cultural production is that when I look at the creativity of African-American artists, or when I tap my toes to different musicians, I realize that what I'm learning is a way to understand the diversity of opinions, the diversity of who we are, in ways that just conversations will not get me there. And that I really do think that artists have an ability to be in front, to say things that we're not ready to say across the mainstream, but that they challenge us. So for me, part of what a museum does is a museum should give you a way to think about things differently. It should prod you. It should, yes, give you opportunity to contextualize, but it really ought to be a place like culture that is of value, that it gives people tools to live their lives. It gives people new ways to understand the possibilities of going forward and new ways to appreciate the past. So for me, being in museums allowed me to have conversations with unseen generations, to have conversations with people to say, this culture matters. Yes, it is refreshing and entertaining, but it is also spiritual. It is also instructive. It is also about helping you see the variety of ways you can change a nation.
Yeah. Mayor, you have a cameo appearance on the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Probably some other stuff out there. So talk to us a little bit about your own sense of art and social change.
Yeah, my father would said once that the noblest function of art is to oppose what is ugly. And, ultimately that's what the function of it is in my mind, to oppose ugly. We just have to come to an agreement of what ugly is. And sometimes that differs, right? And so I grew up listening to Black music, listening to, first of all, international music for the most part, but seeing people like Nina Simone and John, and in my basement, Max Roach, Abby Lincoln, folks like that, great poets, great writers, and the relationship between art and culture and politics and social movements was really the same thing to me, right? Even watching Eyes on the Prize, like I said, just listening to the spirituals turn political civil rights marches, it wasn't just about making people feel good, but it actually tied the struggle to a larger spiritual kind of fight. Basically, God is on our side kind of thing that motivated people into continuing to push against all odds, against all things that's happened. And in college, reading Blues People, understanding how we chronicled African-American history through music. The period of every time you can listen to the music and hear where we are historically in this country and in the world by the music that's being played, even music that had no lyrics, right? And so that showed me very early the power of art, the power of culture, not only to chronicle what's going on historically, but to also move people into doing things, to excite them, to exaggerate them, to get them involved and engaged spiritually and intellectually in things bigger and greater than themselves. It helps them engage and make that relationship. And so, it was also said that art is, that culture is a weapon, right? It can be used against you or for you. And so most of the time I try to use art and culture in my own advancement towards my personal growth and the growth of the people of this community, of this city. And so it's valuable and important to me.
That's right. And hence NJ Pack helping to not only be part of Newark's and your own leadership, but also this national conversation. So if there's a call to action for the film, Don, you know, you're the filmmaker. You've got this through line about the 2018 election and the work that Congressman Lewis himself did on the campaign trail, and questions from Stacey Abrams about voter suppression and her own close loss to Brian Kemp. How should viewers be thinking about this film in light of the choices they have to make in just over a month?
You know, I think echoing, you know, what the mayor said, I'm gonna come at that a little bit from one of the artistic choices I made in the movie, and that's the music. And the music is the composer's, her name is Tamar Kali. She worked with Dee Rees on the film Mudbound. This was the first documentary she'd done. And I asked her to write a modern spiritual because I wanted to connect, you know, the past to the present, which I feel like is exactly John Lewis. So, you know, the goal of that is to deepen the experience of the film. And I really love this idea that you can tell where we are in culture by the music that you hear. So, you know, one of the things Tamar Kali said was, oh, you need a field holler. You know, you need to look to these you know, folk songs. And I just thought that was so important because one of the things Congressman Lewis always did is he continued the oral tradition of Black culture in repeating stories, in reminding, instead of hiding his past or shrinking in any way from the modest circumstance of his birth and growing up, he celebrated it. Mm-hmm. And in celebrating it, so my point is, in celebrating his past and how he was raised and connection to land and holding on to that, it celebrates the resilience of a people. Mm-hmm. And in celebrating that resilience, you also have to remember what it took to get us to the point to be able to participate in civic governance. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, as we look today, Stacey Abrams says, if the vote wasn't important, they wouldn't try to be shut you up. So the congressman pointed out, and everybody was concerned in 2018, and there was a lot of worry about Brian Kemp purging. 300,000 votes were purged in Georgia. Stacey Abrams lost by 73,000 votes. We find out just last week, the study that was concluded, that 200,000 of those votes were improperly removed. So we need to turn out in record numbers, vote early. And so if there are challenges to be had, or if there are problems, you know, so I was filming on election day 2016 in Ohio. I saw people being turned away. I saw, you know, errors that could not be cured because it was too late. So I would say, particularly in this time of COVID, when everything takes longer and is harder and more challenging, people's polling places have been changed without their knowledge. So if you show up on election day, you may be at the wrong polling place and you won't be able to vote. So really this year more than ever, wherever you are able to vote early, I think is really kind of crucial.
And I know that that some of these conversations are skirt the line of partisanship, Secretary. So I'll just give you the opportunity to say, if there's a story that comes out of the story of the Museum of African American History and Culture about democracy, is it a story that the democracy belongs to all of us? I mean, that's how I think of it.
I think so. I think that what I hope the museum will always be a clarion call to challenge a country to be better. Will always be a clarion call to say that so many people sacrificed, so many people lost lives, so many people lost occupations in order not just to vote, not just to destroy segregation, but to help a country live up to its stated ideals. And as somebody once said to me, they challenged me and said, oh, you have a political agenda. Absolutely. To make a country better through history.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. So Mayor Baraka, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask you the first question from our audience.
Sure.
And so I have about 8 of them here, and we've got about 15, 20 minutes to go through them. So if anyone wants to pick up a thread because they want to answer the question, just feel free to jump in. So the first question to you, Mayor, is what is a modern example of good trouble?
Well, I think what we see happening now all over the country in these communities, people out here protesting, raising their voices behind what's happening. This whole Black Lives Matter movement. Hopefully we go further than that, but I think that's an example of good trouble. It's also important to make sure that you get out and vote and make sure that people who are being discouraged from voting have the ability to do that as well. So there are a bunch of things that I can lay out as what I think good trouble is, but it's clear as day what's happening right now. All of these young people out in the street is about as good as the trouble you could get in.
Yeah. I mean, one imagines that whether in the very near future or in the not too distant future, things will get murkier. The lines will get blurrier, less clear and demonstrable. And I'm wondering, Don, if there's something that people don't really fully understand about what Congressman Lewis meant when he said that, because it's so infinitely quotable and so clear. But I'm curious if there's something harder about it in the way that Congressman Lewis approached his life's work than what most people are picking up on.
I think, I can tell you a personal story is while we were filming, I would say, oh, Mr. Lewis, this happened. I think like Children in Cages really, really just knocked the wind out of me that this country could be doing that, and the pictures. And he, of course, was, horrified and equally, but he turned the conversation to what was the civic response to that. And so I think it's very important to understand kind of where we began this conversation, the congressman's unrelenting, confidence, but also patience and impatience. He just would not give up. And he basically just kept saying over and over to me, where I was focused on what was making me have some despair, he would focus on what can you do? What are the things you can do? And just refusing to cede the country
Right.
to its darker impulses.
Right.
Yeah.
And I really was, if John Lewis could be optimistic about America, then who am I to take to my bed and be like, woe is me, peace out.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So the next question is, public figures leave us all the time. The loss of John Lewis hurt us, especially Black Americans, profoundly. Why do you think that is in terms of the sense of loss at this particular moment? And I guess we could also add Justice Ruth Ginsburg.
Well, I would say that, ultimately, these people represent not just themselves, but there are many people who are participating in struggle vicariously through them, right? Who are experiencing the struggle in America through their struggles, through the things that they see them do, say, fight for. And it gives them hope. The hope that they have, as Dawn pointed out, gives other people hope. And that's this kind of unrelenting faith. Like some people, he didn't, and a lot of elected officials and public figures don't have the luxury of pessimism. So they don't get to go home and be sad about it, right? They have to get up the next day and get at it. And that inspires like millions of people to want to do and to get involved in this. So when those people are gone, it actually takes a piece of people's spirit away, a piece of people's soul away. It takes some of their fight away as well, because it's difficult getting up every single day dealing with what you have to deal with as a regular working person, and then every day listening to the news and different things that are happening over and over again, is disenchanting, it's hurtful, it's depressing, and you need modern day superheroes. Though my mother says no such thing as Superman, right? And that at the end of the day, these people out here and the work that they do inspire so many people to be better than who they are. And so that's why it's important. And now it's probably more important than ever.
And I think that what these people symbolize is that in many ways, they're really wonderful at defining reality and yet still giving hope. I think in many ways that what you're really looking for are totems that tell you these things are possible,
Right.
that you can believe in things that you can't see, even though you may face it at your level every day. To suddenly have it raised up through a John Lewis gives you an understanding that you are in the fight, and that in essence, it is incumbent upon you to continue the struggle. But you need those moments of lightning, those people of light that give you a sense that change is possible, because we all believe in a better day, but you've got to see steps towards that. And these people like John Lewis give us those steps to possibility.
Yeah. You're sharing that, Secretary Bunch, reminds me of when Congressman Lewis visited the Schomburg just when the first March book of the trilogy was published. He was there with the co-author to do a book event for our young people. And I took him back into the archive, showed him the papers of Ella Baker, who of course had been part of the effort to build SNCC and had been a great advisor and a tremendous leader amongst those young people. He looks at the piece of paper, and it happened to be the minutes from an October 1960 meeting of SNCC. And he starts to tear up and he says, "I remember this meeting."
Mm.
And I share that story because, to your point, Secretary Bunch, like, there is real tactile strategic work that young people need to know happens, because it's not just looking at the person and admiring as a ray of light and hope that there are people fighting the good fight, as Mayor Baraka says, but also that it's real. It's words on paper, it's meeting notes, it's mistakes, it's uncertainty. And so it takes away the notion that these folks have a cape hidden behind their suit jackets, but in fact that they're real people.
Real people.
I completely agree with that. And, showing the bit we showed about, I just love the picture of him on the floor with a pencil and making notes, like that's the kind of messy meeting that most of us are used to, where you just get out there and you get it done. And that was among the pictures I had never seen before, that really, I just really spoke to me, that level of organizing.
Yeah. So we have a question about young people and what they learn in school. So someone writes, "I teach 8th grade U.S. history to mainly white students in Atlanta. How would you suggest that white teachers go about teaching white students about the history of race in America?"
Truthfully. I really, I've been an educator for 20 something years, man. I just, short of just the cultural relevance and making sure people's are present in the things that you're teaching, I think ultimately the content is the content, right? The methodology of how you do that, right? It may differ, but the content is the content. I think it is important to give people access to the content. And the problem that, most of what white America does not have is access to, in fact, most of America don't have access to the content, access to what really happened, the information itself. They're not forced to deal with these things. It is always a sanitized version of what really is. And I think we need to trust the instincts and the intelligence of these young people and give them the opportunity to face what actually is and what happened, because you do a disservice not just to Black people, but you also do a disservice to white people and to all people. White supremacy is created because of a false narrative, because of misinformation. And it is important for us to teach them exactly what took place and the motivation behind it, right? In all aspects of it. And I think it's easy to do that by teaching history from the viewpoint of the people and working people, as opposed to the viewpoint of presidents and kings and aristocracy. Because usually we teach from up down, who was in charge, and this is all the things that they've done, as opposed to movements of people's history, how they moved from place to place, why they moved, and what happened as a result of that. Because the Civil Rights Act didn't get passed because Lyndon B. Johnson was kind and gentle. It got passed because of the work that the people did in the community to make sure that it got passed.
I mean, in some ways, part of what you want people to realize is that we have now had over 50 years of really good scholarship on issues of race, so that you can dip into that reservoir. The work that you've written, Khalil, and so many others, has been crucial to this. And I think the other piece is to frame this so that you're not teaching white folks about black folks. Right. You're teaching white folks about themselves, about America. And for me, what a good teacher could do is, by using this history, is help these kids embrace ambiguity. And I think that rather than giving people simple answers to complex questions, recognize the long struggle, the shades of gray. And I think that, in my mind, would be a major contribution, not just to kids in school, but to all Americans. And that's what I think these teachers have the opportunity to do now.
Yeah. Well, all Americans start out as kids in school, so.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah. So if you could, so someone's asking for book recommendations. So if you could select one book to recommend today to help us educate and enlighten, what book would you choose?
I mean, I'm really enjoying Cast. You know, I just, in the first 30 pages, you know, she just has a way of crystallizing two things that stood out for me in that book.
Isabel Wilkerson's book, right?
Yes, Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast, yes. That biologically 99.9% of human biology is the same, that the word Caucasian is invented. I mean, that kind of just blew my mind. And it's a crazy story about the word Caucasian by the person who invented it. It has no meaning. And that the concept of whiteness, and if you think about it, it seems so obvious, but is invented. It was a way of just separating from people with dark skin. But the Danes have no more in common with the Russians than you or I do necessarily, but except that if you gather people and rename them white, it is a way to distinguish from people who are not of European descent. And then once establishing those false distinctions, then people fighting to the death to preserve them and to invent reasons why the distinctions are made in the first place. So you invent racial distinctions, you invent distinctions in intelligence or, biology that are not there. And like, it's kind of the ultimate fake news.
Yeah. or the longest running disinformation campaign, right?
Right.
Yeah. Any other hot takes on books that you want to mention to the audience?
I think I would recommend people reading David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass. That here is a story that tells us about what is possible in America, the challenges of that, the kind of allies that were needed to affect change, to look at someone born enslaved who then became the most visible, sort of most photographed man in the 19th century. I just think it's one of the great biographies. It's a tome, so you've got to commit to it, but it's one of the great biographies I've ever read.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to show the fact that I have this book right here.
I'll hold up Cass. I have it here, right here.
That I have that. And I would like to go back for a little bit and recommend a book that is older because we talked about these modern, and that's Black Reconstruction
Yeah.
And the reason I say that because I think it is so pertinent
Author,
to what's happening now.
Du Bois, author, just tell us.
Yeah, W. Du Bois. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, Black Reconstruction is incredibly important, even in the present sense. I don't know if we can get a copy of it. Maybe you go to the Schomburg somewhere. But at the end of the day, it's important. It's an important work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know that people appreciate that. So another question around educators and how they can engage. Obviously, a lot of educators have tuned in tonight to join this conversation. As educators, how can we continue to honor John Lewis's legacy in the classroom? In regards to cultural production, what tools or instruments should we be teaching the next generation about the history of the civil rights movement, about voter suppression, about the people who fought for the Voting Rights Act of 1965? So I guess this is more about all the other things than just what's in the textbook. And I know that Mayor Brock has talked a lot about Eyes on the Prize. Maybe tell us a little bit about that, because I've used it myself, and it's kind of shocking to imagine that it is not taught in every single classroom in a high school at some point along the way. I mean, there's nothing, I suppose there are things dated about it because some of the narratives of civil rights get complicated as people dig into it, but it's just so incredible. So Eyes on the Prize, other things?
Yeah, I would say, and the question is, are there other, so can you repeat that so I can make sure I answer?
Yeah, cultural production tools, instruments, can you engage students?
Yeah, so Eyes on the Prize to me was like this quintessential piece. I think that it is so much information in there that I had to watch it several more times when I became an adult, really to figure out what was happening. And right now, everything is so available, on the internet and everything else. You can get your hands on so many different mediums and so much information. I think this is the first generation that has more knowledge than all other generations, more access to information than all the other generations combined. So, all of this stuff is out there for us to get our hands on, that's for sure. And that's a whole nother show to list all of the things that you can be able to grab.
Yeah.
One of the
incredible, for this kind of archival stuff. Yep.
One of the things that Dawn's film does is remind us that what you really want educators to do is to help reduce this to human scale. Mm-hmm. That the notion of the civil rights movement, the notion of slavery, the notion of battling segregation, they get overwhelming to kids. But if you can reduce it to human scale, let them see what it did to John Lewis in Troy, Alabama, and what he did to counter it, really allows people to sort of see it in a way that they too have a role and can play a bigger role than they could expect. So this notion of reducing things to human scale was really important to me as we built the museum, because I didn't want people to I didn't want these things to just sweep over people. I wanted people to actually care about other human beings struggling to find fairness in this country.
Mm-hmm. So we've got two last questions I'm going to combine. One is about meaningful comparisons between Black Lives Matter activists today and civil rights activists. And anyone can take that on. And the last one is, what brings you hope in this moment of tumult in the nation?
I mean, one thing I will say is, I know that the congressman was incredibly proud of the Black Lives Matter activists. I think that to the extent people are, which the overwhelming amount of people are, non-violently but assertively, asserting the need to recognize equal humanity, that he feels is his legacy. It's not an accident that his last photograph is standing proudly in front of that art installation in Washington, D.C., kind of proudly. He was very weak at that point. It was, very important to him to go to do that. The thing I will say, but I give this a very large caveat because I do not feel that I've studied the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives, as much as I need to. I would like to know more about the offense, to go back to our original conversation. I think they're doing a marvelous job of publicizing and rallying people, and you need to capture public attention that way. That's one of the ways that the civil rights movement was so effective, is capturing the imagination of the public. But I would love to see some of those, incredible organizers. I think that they have tried to flatten the movement in terms of not having, one leader or anything like that. And I do understand that, and I think there's roles in that, but we need more offense. I think that's my opinion, but I'm welcome to be challenged and told that I'm wrong, and there's a lot of offense happening. I just wish I'm paying attention, and I'm not seeing as much as I would like.
So those two questions, Hope and BLM.
Well, for me, Black Lives Matter is very powerful, right? But I agree with Dawn. The question for me is, so how do we sustain this? What are the sort of measurable goals? How do you make sure that when you take advantage of the visibility, that it's pushing you in a direction, that you're accomplishing something? I don't want anybody to be held captive by the civil rights, but I'm not saying that's the best model today. But it is a model that suggests that you've got to make sure that everything you do pushes the movement in certain directions, whether it is getting more attention and you use that to move things, whether it is thinking about how do you bring different groups together under an umbrella like SNCC. So I think that's one of the challenges. What gives me hope? History. No doubt about it. History tells me that all of us in this call come from a community that believed in an America that didn't believe in them, that found ways to affect change, to not only always struggle, but to find hope and happiness. So for me, even in the darkest moments, I keep thinking that I'm not chopping cotton, and I need to then figure out how to draw from the past to keep pushing me forward to fight for today and tomorrow.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah. I wanted to say that I think the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement are almost one and the same kind of thing. Even with the struggle around SNCC and CORE and Lowndes County Freedom Organization, a lot of the same kind of sentiment exists today with these young people. And I do think they're attempting that offense around the defund movement, around changing laws, and I think they're beginning to see the systemic kind of issues around racism, and not just individuals. It's not just individuals who are causing or doing racist acts. There's systems involved in it, which is why defund is being talked about, and other things about reimagining America in a different way, continuing the fight for democracy and Reconstruction that never really took fruition, right? Never took hold. The Reconstruction was ended before it could really play itself out, and I think that fight is there. I think there's some the cons to not having a leader or not having visible people in the front. There are pros to that, but there's also a downside to that. Downside is also not having clarity of where we going and who to follow and what's happening, which allows people to come in and say they're the leader, I'm the leader, this person is the leader. So they take the message of the movement to a place that it wasn't meant to be, or say they're in charge when they're not in charge. So that's the downside of that. And we have to really figure that out, how to message it properly so people are catching on to what this means, so people can't define for us what we mean by Black Lives Matter or defund or moving forward or struggle or all of those things. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think that this was an incredible conversation. I'm incredibly grateful for all of you. For Dawn, for Secretary Bunch. Thank you, Dawn, for making an incredible film. Thank you, Secretary Bunch, for joining us tonight and sharing so much about the work of the Congressman in building the museum and being a model for a future that has yet to come. And to the mayor, who's on the ground trying to bridge the gap between the past and the present, I'm grateful for your leadership. So thank you to the audience for joining us. Thank you to NJPAC for putting this together, and to all of the arts organizations around the country who helped promote this film and the conversation. If you haven't watched the film, we encourage you to rent it through September 30th through your local performing arts center. Remember that $5 of your $12 rental goes back to the organization through which you rent the film. So this is a wonderful win-win for everyone. To close out our program, we're thrilled to share a short dance film entitled In Memory, a tribute to John Lewis. It was choreographed, performed, and filmed by Jamar Roberts. Roberts is choreographer in residence of Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater and has been a dancer with the company since 2002. The music is Kwame Coleman, a pianist, composer, and musicologist. The piece was commissioned by the March on Washington Film Festival and premiered earlier tonight as part of their gala. I encourage you to check out the film festival, which is taking place virtually this week at marchonwashingtonfilmfestival.org or MOWFF. Enjoy it, enjoy the choreography, the work of Alvin Ailey, and have a wonderful evening.